everyone. My name is Lu Vickers, and I'm coming to you from my kitchen in Tallahassee, Florida, where I've been doing Zoom for the past couple of months in my other life as a teacher. And there's always going to be some kind of weird thing happening. Hopefully my cat won't Zoom bomb us. Here she comes right now. She Zoom bombs me every time she knows that I'm about to do something. Here she is. I want to thank Linda Citro and the committee for the Lemon Bay Fest for inviting me to be part of this virtually. I really appreciate that. And I hope I can, do a pretty good job here so you can understand a little bit more about the history of Weeki Wachee. So one of the first things people ask me about Weeki Wachee is how did I end up writing a book about mermaids? And I grew up in North Florida in Chattahoochee, where the mental institution is. And we stayed in North Florida mostly. My parents had 4 kids, and so we didn't have a lot of money to be traveling all over the place. And so we would go to Panama City and stay in the little hotels down there and go to Goofy Golf and things like that in the Miracle Strip back when it existed. So that was kind of the extent of my travels around Florida. But I still saw the Weeki Wachee billboard with the big mermaid on it, and it advertised the breathing underwater at Weeki Wachee, and I was totally enthralled by that as a kid. And remember swimming at Lake Seminole, pretending to be a mermaid, and the image just never left me. And so when I grew up and became a writer, I would include stories about the mermaids at Weeki Wachee. I would include, little details about that in the stories I was working on. And then when I found out that Newton Perry actually worked at the lodge at Wakulla Springs, which is only about 16 miles from my house, when I found out that Newton Perry, he founded Weeki Wachee, but he was actually working at Wakulla Springs for a while, that kind of really made me want to write a novel about Weeki Wachee. So I actually started writing the novel, while teaching full time. And then I realized I have to go to Weeki Wachee. I obviously can't write this novel unless I actually go there and meet some actual mermaids. And so I did. And the first time that I went to Weeki Wachee, a group of older mermaids were performing, and they were called the Tales of Yesteryear. And they had formed a group one year. I think it was one of the reunions. They decided to form this group and start performing. They became a huge hit. And so when I went down there was a really big crowd to see them perform. And so the first 2 people I met were Mary Darlington Fletcher, this is Mary, and her brother Ed, also known as Ed the Great. And they took me in and they shared stories with me and invited me to come back, and so I did. And I went back many, many times to talk to mermaids, to watch the shows, and to interview people. This was Ed back in the heyday. Ed put on a mermaid tail for one of the reunions. He was showing off. He was prone to do that. Very funny guy. And so everybody loved Ed. And like I said, he was known as Ed the Great. And I'll be telling more stories about him a little later. He's sitting on one of the props that was used at Weeki Wachee after after it became a multi-million-dollar business with ABC, but I'll get more into that in a minute. This is a picture of Mary performing in front of the very, very first theater that was sunk at Weeki Wachee. And she told me the story about how she and Ed became involved with becoming mermaids and mermen at Weeki Wachee. Weeki Wachee was originally their swimming hole. It was not owned by anybody. It was just a swimming hole. And they would go up there swimming. And so one day they went up to go swimming and it was blocked off. They couldn't go swimming. And so Mary said she went and found the guy who had put up the no entry signs and asked him, "What are you doing? This is our spring." And he told her, "I'm going to put a theater down here and I'm going to have a mermaid show. And if you would like to be part of it, come back next weekend and you can do a tryout." And so, of course, she did. She brought some of her friends and they tried out by swimming across the spring, as Mary said. And if you didn't drown, you became a mermaid. And so that's how she got her start. And this was one of the things they did in the original shows was to feed the fish, and they still do that today. So that's Mary in the first theater, in front of the first theater. Now, long before Newton Perry came to Weeki Wachee, long before he opened it, he lived in Silver Springs. His family had moved from up north to the south. They settled near Ocala, and Newton Perry became a lifeguard at Silver Springs. He was still a teenager, but he was a really good swimmer. And so he was teaching people how to swim, but he was also coming up with ideas for underwater shows and underwater activities because he was so taken with how clear the water was. He thought it would be perfect to stage shows underwater. So he started doing that at Silver Springs in the 20s. This photograph was made in the 20s. And this photograph was also made in the 20s. I think it's like 1928. And in this photograph is Newton Perry's, his wife, his sister, and I think a sister-in-law in this photograph underwater. In this photograph, you see this fellow here is Newton Perry. You can tell by the period swimsuits, you know, it's like 20s or 30s. And this fellow here is Johnny Weissmuller. And they were filming one of those newsreels for Grantland Rice. And these newsreels would be shown in theaters before the feature film was shown. So in this little short film, they were catching turtles. So they had a turtle catching contest. And so that was at Silver Springs. He and Johnny Weissmuller and Newton Perry were good friends way before he became really famous. And this is Newton Perry. You can see what a big guy he is here. And that's him with Johnny Weissmuller at Silver Springs during the filming of one of the Tarzan movies there. Okay, so what I'm about to show you here is a short film that was made at Silver Springs. And it features Newton Perry. And you can see him here, and I'm going to be quiet and let this play so you can hear it.
The lovely stretch of water and woodland known as Silver Springs, Florida, is the most perfect setting for underwater photography in the whole of America. As you sail up its tree-bordered reaches, you're amazed at the crystal clearness of the water and the smoothness of the submerged limestone rocks. Today, we're lucky enough to drop in while preparations are being made for a show. An underwater circus, and most of the props you'd expect to find in an earthly circus are being got ready for the depth. Setting up the scenery on the bottom is rather a wet job, so the stagehands wear tin hats to keep the water out of their ears. While they're going down, they get air by the pumpful. Every bit of scenery has to be weighted to make it stay put, and even the hot dogs will be heavy on the chest. Underwater acting is just one damp thing after another. In a maze of stakes and guy ropes, the circus is taking shape. We know what to do if we feel hungry, but what happens if we feel dry? For our underwater pictures, we've brought our little submarine camera. It fits onto a platform inside a steel cylinder, made especially to resist water pressure and the advances of brazen mermaids. Just as the props are weighted, so must the performers be. The anklets are just heavy enough to do what their parents found extremely difficult, keep them under. Even the garlands have to be made of leaden flowers. Well, now we're all set and the camera's fixed, so let her go, George. Swim up, swim up, swim up for the greatest, slickest, grandest, loveliest, daintiest, and wettest circus in the world. Mussolowski, famous strongman, can raise anything except a couple of pounds in a hurry. Wonder if he's got any cigarette pictures. The hula hula, and her mother told her never to sit on wet grass. He's so strong he can break a promise with his little finger. And now for the most sensational, most stupendous, most ridiculous tight wire act in the universe, or thereabouts. Sit back and gasp at the amazing skill of these daredevil sprites. Did we say tight wire? That's not the only thing that's tight. Alley, up! La Belle Maggie Smith. She started by walking on air and then on thin ice. But now she's as used to a wire as a telegraph boy. Did you ever see such a saucy seesaw? They may take a lot of money, but they can't take a single breath. Gee, that's a good idea. These hot dogs are made from water spaniels. And they say the hot dog man sunk all his capital in floating his business. My, my.
Okay, y'all, I'm back. That was a little glitch, but it wasn't too bad, was it? There's my face again. So that little film featured Newton Perry. You can see him in there as Mussolowski, and so you can see how creative he was then with the underwater circus. And also Ginger Stanley is in this photograph. Ginger Stanley worked with him at Weeki Wachee later, and then she also worked with him over at Silver Springs. So she was one of his models. And this photograph was made by Bruce Moser, who was a very famous underwater photographer who worked at Silver Springs for many, many decades. And Bruce and I were friends. He worked with me on a couple of different projects, was an amazing, really creative person till the very end of his life, really amazing person. So they would do things, obviously mowing underwater, things like that. This is a postcard that was made at Silver Springs, and I'm pretty sure that's Newton Perry. I'm not sure who the woman is, probably one of his sisters. And they would do these postcards and send them out. This was also made at Silver Springs, and this was the fellow in this photograph is Rico Browning, who also played, he was the underwater character in The Creature from the Black Lagoon. He did all the underwater parts. So that's an image of Rico Browning and Ginger Stanley. They both did underwater parts in Creature from the Black Lagoon, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. There's Ginger, and the person behind her that's Bruce Moser making that photograph with one of his unique cameras that he made to make photographs underwater at Silver Springs. And this is another photo made at Silver Springs, because Silver Springs, they have the glass bottom boats. And so Newton Perry sent a mermaid over there. This was after Weeki Wachee had, started. But they sent a mermaid over there to swim under the boat, make a big to-do about that, which everybody loved, I am sure. Now, what happened is, I would say around 1941, Newton Perry got a call from a man named Ed Ball. And Ed Ball ran the lodge. He owned Wakulla Springs, and he had built a lodge up there. It's still, obviously still here. It was built in the 30s. And he wanted Newton Perry to run it because he had heard of Newton Perry. Newton Perry was famous in the film world because he knew all these people making these short films. He was very well known. And so Ed Ball thought he would be the perfect person to run the lodge at Wakulla Springs. And so the very first thing that Newton Perry did when he got to Wakulla Springs was to find the Tarpon girls. And that was the Tarpon Club, was a synchronized swimming group at the College for Women, which is now FSU. And so he got them to come out and do synchronized swimming performances at Wakulla Springs. And another thing Newton Perry did at Wakulla Springs was he made a lot of underwater films up here too. And every Thanksgiving, they would have a Thanksgiving dinner underwater. And I know he did it back at Silver Springs too. He was really big on having Thanksgiving underwater, where they would eat turkey and drink coffee and do all these different things. And he figured out different ways of making the coffee look real. Like he would put BBs in a can, a coffee pot, and when you poured it from a distance, it looked like coffee. Or they would smoke underwater, and it was a piece of chalk, and they would have swallowed or put a little bit of milk in their mouth, and then take a puff and blow the milk out. And of course, it looked like they were smoking. So he came up with all these techniques to do the same thing you could do above ground, underground. And this is him with a group of the girls from the Tarpon Club at Wakulla Springs, which hasn't really changed that much. Wakulla has not changed that much. It looks exactly like it used to. The water is not as clear, but it still hasn't changed. And this is a scene. They were performing, but as you can see, there's a film. There's someone with a film camera over here, so they were filming this probably for one of those newsreels that they would then show in the theaters. And so this is the Tarpon Club doing their synchronized swimming shows out at Wakulla Springs. And Wakulla Springs was also a place that soldiers would come to. Camp Gordon Johnston was down in Carabel, and they would come up from down there and see the shows. So soldiers would come up a lot of times. And this is a thing they called the hole in the water. My cat wants to get up here. This is a thing called the hole in the water, and it's apparatus where the cameraman can get inside of it and film out into the spring. And the water really was so clear. It was unbelievably clear. It looked like air. It was so clear. There's Newton Perry. He made a series of these little airlocks. And in this one, he's sitting here fishing. He sank a bunch of these airlocks at Wakulla Springs at different parts of the springs. There's another one. You can see it in the background here where they're fencing underwater. And so they ended up taking those out because they did have an incident. I think it was with a soldier who got in. He swam down really deep and had a near drowning. And so they took those out because you had to be trained to really use those. And there's Newton Perry, another one of his little. They look like mailboxes. Now, I talked to some people that knew him while he was at Wakulla Springs, and they were teenagers up at Leon High School here. And one of them was a woman who lived down the street from me. Her name's Nancy Benda. And she was a teenager when she met Newton Perry. And so was Rico Browning, who later, worked for the Creature. He was a teenager too. And Newton Perry trained them to perform underwater at Wakulla Springs. So they knew how to use the airlocks, and he trained them how to do that too. So they would perform underwater, and then they would swim into that little airlock. They had air being pumped into it. They would take a breath of air and then go back and keep performing. That way they wouldn't have to go to the top. And what I'm about to show you here is a little movie. It was a beauty contest that Newt Perry had at Wakulla Springs. So let me make sure the sound's on, and I'll play it for you guys.
Yeah. Florida, in case you didn't know it, has long been famous for mermaids, and the latest news of them comes from a place called Wakulla Springs, where they recently held an underwater mermaid beauty contest. When the judges had made their decision, the mermaids insisted that the coronation itself must be held underwater, so one of the judges, rather ungallantly smoking a pipe, went down with Miss Mermaid to crown her as desired. How does he keep the pipe going underwater? Ah, well, you'd have to go to Florida to know the answer to that one. Margaret was naturally...
Sorry about that, y'all. it's kind of tricky to move between videos and still pictures. But yeah, my friend Nancy Benda, she was actually one of the beauty contestants in that short clip. And I knew one of the other women who would become a mermaid was also in that short clip. And she said they had to like really put some stuff in their hair to make it stiff. And also they had to weight their clothes when they wore clothes and stuff. But you notice they're wearing high heels in that little clip. It's kind of cute. Okay, now this is obviously an elephant. And what happened was when Newton Perry moved to Wakulla Springs to start running the lodge up there, managing it, Tarzan started filming up here. And so they had been filming, they made many films at Silver Springs, but when Newt Perry came to Wakulla Springs, he brought Tarzan with him. The studios loved Newt Perry, and so he's helped scout locations. He helped find local kids to be extras in the movie and stuff like that. And so this was at Wakulla Springs during the filming of one of the Tarzan films. And they also filmed part of Creature from the Black Lagoon up here at Wakulla Springs. And this fellow is Rico Browning. And like I said, Rico Browning was one of the teenagers that trained with Newton Perry at Wakulla Springs and learned how to do all this underwater stuff at Wakulla Springs. It really changed Rico Browning's life. Rico Browning would go on to write Flipper, the show Flipper, the movie. He wrote that, and he did a lot of Gentle Ben movies. He worked for Ivan Torres Studios. So meeting Newton Perry and learning how to perform underwater really changed his life. And so for the Creature from the Black Lagoon, Rico Browning did all the underwater parts. And the story about how he ended up doing that was that Newt Perry called him and said a film crew is coming to Wakulla Springs. They want somebody to go down the river with them to scout out locations. And he asked Rico, could he do it? And so Rico said, okay, I'll pick him up and do it. So he did. And they were on a boat going down the river. And the filmmaker asked Rico, would he mind jumping in the water and swimming so they could kind of get a sense of, how it looked. And Rico has a very unique swim stroke. So when they saw the way he swam, they wanted him to be the creature underwater because he has a unique stroke. And if you've ever watched Creature from the Black Lagoon, there's a really cool scene where Julie Adams, she's the main person, is swimming above water and the creature's under her. And they're doing like this parallel swimming scene. It's really cool. And so he got hired to do it. And so he was a creature, underwater creature. And that's Ginger Stanley with him. And she became the double for Julie. So she did most of the underwater, if not all the underwater shots for that film. So what happened was Newton Perry, while he was at Wakulla Springs, Newton Perry had been asking around for a place. He wanted to find his own spring. He wanted his own place. And so this guy that he knew told him there's a couple of springs on the west coast of Florida, and one of them's called Chestawisky, which was actually Chassawitzka. And he said the other option is a place called Weeki Wachee. And he called it Weeki Wachee, but it was Weeki Wachee. I thought it was kind of funny that he called it Weeki Wachee because one of the mermaids I talked to told me that before it got developed into Weeki Wachee, that people did do their laundry up there on the weekend. So it's possible, that they called it Weeki Wachee as a joke, And as you can see on this sign here, Weeki Wachee was one big word at one time, and they had to break it up so they could get it onto more signs and in smaller spaces. So they broke the word in half. And this is a still from an underwater film that Newton Perry made back in the day when Weeki Wachee opened. And so that's underwater at, Weeki Wachee. And this brochure is probably the first brochure. And my friend Nancy Benda is right here. She's under this person. And Nancy, like I said, Nancy met Newt Perry when she was a a student, up at Leon High School. She was a teenager. And he took her down there when he opened Weeki Wachee. He was good friends with her parents. And he asked her to come to Weeki Wachee with him to help train people to do things underwater. And so she did. And one of the first things they did is they had this adagio pose. And the credit for that goes to Dianne Wyatt Mcdonald, who was also a very early mermaid from St. Petersburg. And I'll talk a little bit more about her in a minute. But this was the very first brochure for the spring. And there's Nick Perry inside the very first theater that they sunk. It wasn't that big. It was kind of small, but people would cram in there and sit on those little wooden benches and just watch the show. It was like going to the moon or something, because at the time, scuba was barely in its infancy. And so people were not accustomed to seeing anybody underwater, much less people out there performing. And so it was pretty exciting for the time period. And of course, you see him talking to filmmakers because he was always involved with filmmakers. And there's my friend Nancy. She was dearly beloved to me. She was amazing. She had an amazing scrapbook too, of all her photographs that she shared with me. And as you can see in the background, there's the underwater theater. And so what they're doing here, you see they're carrying what do you call that? A crate of grapette. And what they would do is they would drink, and they would eat and drink underwater. Okay, so they would drink grapette underwater. They would take it underwater and stash it there. So during a show, they could swim over to the stash and get a bottle of grapette and then drink it down underwater. And you had to learn how to do that, obviously. Okay, Nancy ate everything underwater. She had some grapes one time. She told me they ate a lot of different things. They didn't just eat bananas. They became famous for eating bananas, but they also ate grapes and apples and spaghetti and watermelon and turkey dinners. And then this was one of the very first postcards that was made at Weeki Wachee. And the young ladies in this photograph they were originally the Aquamaids, and they were from St. Petersburg. They were a synchronized swim group over in St. Petersburg. And Newton Perry, of course, was, trying to find mermaids. So he asked them to come over, and they would come over and perform too. And they also did synchronized swimming, but they also did underwater shows. But they weren't using the air hoses like the other mermaids, but they did perform underwater, and they were very famous. And like I said, Dianne was one of the people that came up with the adagio pose, which is one of the famous Weeki Wachee poses. It's actually on the statue outside of the park. There's a big statue there that has two mermaids doing that adagio pose. Okay, this was another one of the early postcards, and Dianne is one of these people. Okay, that's Mary and me. That's Dianne. She wrote me. That's Dianne Wyatt Mcdonald. So she was in the very first postcard that was made at Weeki Wachee. And this was another photograph that came from Dianne Mcdonald's scrapbook. She had an amazing scrapbook with early photos from Weeki Wachee. This was 1947 in December. Weeki Wachee actually opened in October of 1947. So this was a very early photo. And you can see back in the background, you can see the big airlock that Nick Perry built there. And you can also see this fellow, Bill Amick. He was an early performer at Weeki Wachee. A lot of people don't realize men performed there too. Ed, Bill Amick, and there were some other men that performed with the Mermaids too. And you'll see also, I think in these early photographs, they weren't wearing tails. There wasn't a material invented at the time that could work as a mermaid tail underwater. Okay, so they would, they would just perform, without tails. Okay, they were still mermaids, right? Because they're breathing underwater, and I believe that they really were. They would go in these airlocks, take a big breath of air, and then come back out and perform some more. Sometimes they would swim to the surface and get a big gulp of air and then come back and perform. And they learned how to hold their breath for long periods of time so they could do it seamlessly, so that you really did kind of believe, that they were breathing underwater. And this is one of my favorite photos of Dianne Mcdonald. It's her underwater at Weeki Wachee, and you can see the background's pretty cool. They actually called it the mountain underwater because of how it looked back then. And this is an early postcard, a real photo postcard of people watching the show. The world's only underwater theater, Weeki Wachee, Spring of the Mermaids. And in the very beginning, they would actually have to flag people down to come to the shows. And of course, it got big fast. But in the very beginning, they had to flag people down. I think it might have still been a dirt road out there. Things changed a lot over the years. Now, right after Newton Perry opened Weeki Wachee, he got a phone call from Universal Studios, and they were asking him, "Hey, we want to make a mermaid movie. Do you know a good location?" And of course he said, "Weeki Wachee, come on down." And so they did. They came down to film all the underwater scenes at Weeki Wachee, and with William Powell and Ann Blyth, and it was a big excitement for everybody in the area. And so there's Ann Blyth, the movie star, and she's with all of the Aquamaids here. And there's Dianne Wyatt Mcdonald. And so they're just so thrilled, to be able to get her autograph. So that was pretty cool. And there she is underwater, Ann Blyth, and that's Newton Perry. He did train her to swim underwater. She had to do some of the parts underwater. She later wrote an article for one of the movie magazines saying Newton Perry can have all that underwater swimming back. She wasn't a big fan of being underwater for the long periods that were required of her. And you can see in the background, they had sunk a castle into the spring for the movie. So that was pretty cool. Okay, so this is Ann Blyth and her mermaid tail. Now, note she does have on a mermaid tail. So obviously in Hollywood, Bud Westmore was a famous designer. He designed that tail, and it was about a $20,000 tail. And the story that I got told by Nancy, because my friend Nancy actually doubled in that. A couple other girls doubled too, but Nancy Benda was one of the people that doubled for the Mermaid in some of the underwater scenes. And she told me that at night they would take this mermaid tail and hang it up onto sawhorses to dry. And I need to back up for a second because I forgot an important detail, y'all. What happened when they sank that castle into the spring at Weeki Wachee? All the fish left, okay? The fish left. And so the filmmakers said, nobody's going to believe this is underwater because it looks too clear unless there are fish in here, okay? So they basically went down the river, scooped up thousands and thousands of fish, brought them back into the spring. But that wasn't enough. What they figured they had to do is they had to put fish roe on that tail. So they smeared fish roe on that tail. And when they did that, the fish would flock around the mermaid. And so at night, when they hung up the the mermaid tail to dry, Nancy told me bears came out of the woods to attack it. And I actually found a short little newspaper clipping about that bears had actually come out of the woods to attack the tail because they smelled the fish on it. So that was kind of a funny, funny detail about Hollywood. Now there's Nancy, my friend, and she's in that mermaid tail. For the grand showing of Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid, for the premiere, they asked Newt Perry to take a tank over to Tampa, and there he is at the courthouse square. He brought a tank over there full of water, and Nancy would get in that tank, and she would eat and drink and kind of just totally enthrall the crowd. Everybody was like, oh my God, she's in there smoking cigarettes, which she did. But of course, they weren't real cigarettes, and they would never do that now because nobody does that. But it was a piece of chalk, and she would take a drink of milk, and then she would puff it out and freak everybody out. Okay, there she is underwater in the tail in the tank. And there she is being carried by Newt Perry. And Nancy told me that in between her little performances at the Tampa Square, Newt would carry her back to the car to his station wagon, and they would sit in the car and, relax for a few minutes. And she said people would walk by and see her in there with that tail, and it looked very realistic. And she said they would look at Newt and say, "Oh my God, is there anything you can do for her? Have you tried to take her to a doctor, to get her fixed?" And because it looked so realistic. So Nancy said they wouldn't even talk to her. They would just talk to Newt Perry about that tail. They thought it was real. Okay, this is another slide. I'm going to show you some photographs from Weeki Wachee. This is a slide of an underwater show. They had a couple of theaters to begin with, small little theaters. And these are some of the mermaids. They were selling some Weeki Wachee water at the time, and I love the way these mermaids look. And this was another postcard of them feeding the fish, because that's something they would do. Now the hoses, I kind of skipped over that, but the hoses were something that Newt Perry developed over the years, from the time he was at Silver Springs to the time he was at Wakulla Springs. He's trying to figure out how to keep people underwater, and so he came up with the idea of the air hose. And the air hose has compressed air coming out of it, like a tire thing, like if you're pumping your tires. And so you have to learn how to regulate it. And it had a thing on the end that you would bite and you would inhale from that. So you had to learn how to do that without blowing your head off with compressed air. So it's very tricky. And of course, the mermaids, they not only were able to look good, while doing it, they look beautiful. Okay. And so one thing a lot of people forget about the mermaids is that they had to be incredible athletes, because they're underwater for shows, 40 minutes at a time, 3 or 4 times a day in this cold water, and they're performing. So they were remarkable athletes and performers. Now this photograph here, this is not a mermaid, but this is one of the very first fashion shoots that was made outside. And this was a photograph made by Tony Frizzell at Weeki Wachee, and it's been used many times. In fact, University Press of Florida used this as the cover of the second Weeki Wachee book I did with Bonnie Georgiadis, where we just did a collection of photos. And they chose to use this image, which had been used on albums, record albums, and other, other kinds of projects. But the reality was, it was made at Weeki Wachee, so that's why they wanted to use it. It's kind of an iconic photo. And this photo, too, was inside the brochure, and that's Nancy. This is Nancy Tribble Benda, my friend, or Nancy Benda Tribble, my friend. And this gives you an idea of the landscape, and you can see why they would call it the mountain underwater at Weeki Wachee. And there's Nancy, and she told me, oops, I'm going to go back to that. Oops. Nancy told me that this picture really represented to her what it meant to be a mermaid, and why she loved it so much. She said you just were flying, it was silent. There was no sound, it was, except for maybe the gurgling of water here and there. But, it was just a beautiful feeling, this weightlessness that you had. And so I talked to a lot of mermaids that said that was part of the appeal, was being in this weightless environment, for up to an hour at a time. You're just using an air hose, and you're just literally in another world, and how quiet it was. So this postcard shows a mermaid eating an apple. Like I said, they would eat other things too. And you can see she has a face mask on her arms. A lot of them did wear face masks during shows. Sometimes the water would, your eyes would be affected by being on the water so much. And also you can see, you can't see if you're not wearing a mask. I mean, everything's blurry. And you can see the hose here, so you get a glimpse of several aspects of the mermaid. And this is a famous photo of a mermaid eating the bananas, because bananas were easy to eat, so they kind of went to those. And you can see she's holding the hose too. She has a hose with her. And this is just a photo, probably 60s, probably at Weeki Wachee, just the way it looks, really cool. And they have on their Jantzen swimsuits because they're showing off that logo there, you know. I'm sure they got free Jantzen swimsuits. Now, this is a photograph that was made because Weeki Wachee had its own staff photographers, and one of them was Sparky Shoemaker. And they had a couple more, too, that worked there to make photographs, and they would send these photographs out to newspapers. Back in the day, newspapers loved stuff like this. They needed to fill the pages, and they loved these kind of photographs, and they would run these pictures with a little caption. And, of course, it was free advertising, you know, for Weeki Wachee, too. And this little girl is actually one of the youngest mermaids ever. She never performed at Weeki Wachee, but she was friends with the people that, or her family was friends with the Newt Perry's partner, Hal Smith, and so they were friends with them. And so she would come down in the summer, and when she came down, the mermaids taught her how to go underwater and use the hose and feed the fish. And so she was one of the youngest people ever. She had a little friend that went with her, and they both learned how to do underwater, you know, feeding the fish and just hanging out underwater, which is very hard to do. Okay, this is a short film I'm going to show. So let me hide myself again and make sure the sound's on.
Beauty in the deep, the fascinating beauty of the underwater world, where we explore the mystery of ancient fable. The fable of mermaids who live at Weeki Wachee. Two of the stars in this world's greatest underwater spectacle swim out to perform graceful acrobatic routines in the crystal clear water, set against the background of Florida's underwater Grand Canyon. Weeki Wachee is the largest single spring in Florida, pouring forth 168 million gallons of water daily, and always at a temperature of 74 degrees. In this magnificent setting, the world's most highly skilled underwater artists entertain daily in a performance of beauty and daring. Viewed from the new $1 million underwater theater in year-round air-conditioned comfort. The great conch shell at the canyon's rim is actually an airlock where mermaids await their cue, breathing air until they emerge to perform their excitingly beautiful routines. Thrills that have been enjoyed by millions of people. Underwater, the body is weightless because of the greater density of water over air. And these two charmers demonstrate their skill by going up or down without apparent movement, simply by controlling the body's air content. Now, a pretty mermaid swims toward the theater to give us a closer look at one of the most unusual scenes ever filmed. It's snack time, and this proves that fish do not fear people. These friendly little fellows have learned that every hour during the day, at every performance, food will be served, and by such a charming hostess. Mermaids get appetites, too. This is probably one of the most difficult feats of all the unique features at Weeki Wachee, actually eating underwater. Drink drinking underwater too? Of course, but you have to be real thirsty. How was it? Now, a daring mermaid attempts a deep dive to the bottom of the canyon. She breathes hard into the mask to equalize the pressure on her ears. She begins her dive, down into the depths, 117 feet below the surface, equal to the height of a 10-story building. Inhaling the life-giving air from the hose, and then forcing air into the mask to balance the increasing pressure on her ears. For every 33 feet she descends, the pressure on her body increases over 14 pounds per square inch. She fights the tremendous current surging up from the spring, over 116,000 gallons a minute. It's a battle every foot of the way. Now, at the bottom, wedged in the rocks to withstand the upthrust of the spring. Then, soaring up, riding the swift currents to the surface. Pausing in graceful underwater acrobatics, taking time to adjust gradually to the lessening pressure as she approaches the top. Floating in the luminous beauty of water and sky. One of the wondrous beauties of nature combined with skill and daring. Truly beauty in the deep at Weeki Wachee on Florida's Sun Coast.
Okay, I'm back, y'all. Okay, let's get rid of that. That video is a really good representation of everything they did at Weeki Wachee in those early days. You know, feeding the fish, the eating, the drinking underwater, and then the deep dive. And the deep dive, to me, is like, it's one of the most difficult things you can imagine because you're swimming down into the spring, right? And it's really hard to do. There's water coming up, and you know, so it was a very athletic thing to do. And so you would have to swim down there, and then to stay down there, a lot of times they told me they would hook their feet under, they had a piece of metal wedge down there, and they would hook their feet there and wait a few minutes. And then, you know, they'd have to come up slowly because it's like decompressing after a scuba dive. You know, you have to come up slowly through the water. And some of the mermaids could, you know, go down there for 2 or 3 minutes. And so it was a pretty scary thing too, because, you know, you didn't know if they were going to come back up. You know, of course, the announcer was always making it more scary than it probably was, but I always thought it was scary because I'm claustrophobic. Anyway, some of the mermaids told me tricks they played on the audience. One woman told me, she said, I went down there and I stayed longer than I normally did, and apparently the audience freaked out because they didn't think she was coming back up. And when she did come back up, the announcer asked her to come immediately to the office to be talked to. And then another mermaid played a trick on them by she wore 2 swimsuits, and when she got to the bottom, she took off one of the swimsuits and sent it up on the hose, the air hose. She sent it up through the water, and so they thought she was took her clothes off, which she didn't, but she was tricking them. So this photograph is mermaids gone. Oops, where'd it go? It went away. This is a photo of Ginger Stanley and 2 other mermaids, and you can see they're cutting up. They have beers and cigarettes. So they're cutting up, they're having fun, clowning around. Now, some of the mermaids, they actually did have cottages there. Once ABC took over, they had built cottages there for the mermaids. So some of the mermaids actually lived in cottages on site. And they would tell me stories like even after they performed all day long, they would still go swimming, you know, because they love swimming so much. Now, this is another airlock that's actually still there, unless they moved it since the last time I went. This is a big dome airlock. And like I said, when they're performing, they do have the air hoses, but sometimes they would swim into the airlock in between little acts that they were doing, and then they would get a breath of air, and then they would go back into the spring. So that's that airlock that's down there. And at one point they had a castle over it, and they've had a conch shell over it one time. So it's appeared in different ways. Now this is after ABC. ABC came along and bought Weeki Wachee. And ABC bought Silver Springs. That's the American Broadcasting Company. And when they bought it, they built $1 million theater, which was a huge deal. And that's the theater back there. And that's the theater that is there now. And they've recently, I think they've uncovered this roof because they had covered it up in the 70s. After it got sold, another company came and covered it. And so I think they're trying to restore it to its original state. And in this photo too, you'll see they are wearing tails. By this point, Lycra had been invented, spandex and stretchy materials. It would be easier for them to, to go underwater in lightweight materials and things like that. You had to be careful swimming in a tail. And in fact, they said they had two kinds of tails. One was a posing tail that had the zipper in the back, and one was a performing tail, and it had the zippers on the sides, so you could get out of them quickly if you got into some kind of, dangerous situation. So this is inside the new theater that was built in the 60s, and you can see a huge crowd here. People, they were performing 9 shows a day, I think, at the peak. At the peak of their success, they were performing all these shows. They had about 25 mermaids on staff. And they had lines out the door in the beginning of the ABC era. And they hired this woman to come over. She had been a choreographer. I think her name's Loretta. She had been a choreographer with one of the circuses. And so she came over. And so by this point, they also had the ability to beam sound out into the spring. They had underwater speakers. So the mermaids could now hear what was going on. And so they started creating these elaborate shows for them to perform underwater. And you'll see they have props, they have costumes. So everything changed dramatically from the 50s when they were just pretty much, doing ballet, and it was beautiful and it was otherworldly. But when ABC came along, it was like Hollywood. No, was it Hollywood Underwater? I think they call it Hollywood Underwater, or Broadway, something like that. Okay, now this is my friend Bonnie. Bonnie Georgiadis worked at Weeki Wachee longer than anyone else I knew, and she swam underwater for a very long time. And this is her in what they called the hole. It was a hole in the theater in the back where the mermaids would climb down this hole and enter the spring from this hole. Prior to this, they would either dive in from the roof or they would swim across the spring, from the other side. And ABC wanted it to look as real as possible. So the mermaids just would enter through this long tunnel. And it was long. It was like, 15 feet down and quite a number of feet out. And it was a tunnel. And so it was really scary because catfish would get in there. One time a mermaid said her hair got hung up on one of the light fixtures. She had to wrench it off. So it was very scary to go through this tunnel. So being a mermaid required a lot of stamina and also being really brave to do these kinds of things. And Bonnie was invaluable to me. I couldn't have written the book without Bonnie. She was amazing. And then we worked together on a separate project. And I'm very indebted to her. Now, this is the conch shell I was telling you guys about. This was over the dome. So what they would do is they'd swim inside that conch shell, and it was an airlock. So it's pretty amazing. And there's Bonnie on one of the props. Bonnie was in a lot of photographs because the photographer loved her because he could get her to do all these things, and she looked good doing it. So he asked her to do a lot of underwater shoots that would go out to newspapers and things. So there she is on one of the props for one of the shows. And then they started doing shows. Like I said, prior to this, they were doing underwater ballet, but when ABC came, they started doing actual shows. And this was Alice in Waterland. This was one of the shows they did. And this is another photo, like whatever holiday was being celebrated, or like this could have been National Barber Day or something. Whatever the national day was, they would have a photo shoot, and it would go out to the newspaper. So this was probably like National Barber Day or National Hairdresser Day or something like that. And I love the oversized comb. And this was a baseball game underwater. That's Bonnie playing baseball. They also played football underwater. They did a lot of really cool shoots. And you can see the airlock in the back there. This is back to Alice in Waterland show. And there's Bonnie feeding fish. This was a postcard. A cafe underwater. Everything had to be weighted down so it wouldn't float off. And these are the twins, Holly and Dolly. And they had a show that was based off one of the space trips. And so they had Mermaids on the Moon. And so they, as you can see in the background, they turned the airlock into like a spaceship. And Holly and Dolly, you can see their feet are wedged under a bar there so they don't float off. So they had to come up with all these different techniques to stay underwater so they wouldn't float away. And this was another show they had. And their hula skirts had weights on them so that they wouldn't float up. So everything had to be weighted. And this was Snow White, the dwarfs. More bananas and hoses, drinking. And this was, like I said, this was at the height of their popularity because Disney hadn't come to town yet. Disney had not come to town, so they had 25 mermaids on staff at least and doing 9 shows a day. So Weeki Wachee was the place to go. There's Bonnie in a postcard that made it into like the tackiest postcard book ever, which I didn't think it was tacky. I thought it was cool. And then Elvis came. Elvis Presley came. They were filming Follow That Dream at Crystal River, and Elvis Presley came to Weeki Wachee. Okay, he came to Weeki Wachee, and so they were ready for him when he got there. And a million girls came from all over the South, all over the southern states to Weeki Wachee and trampled all the bushes. That's the story I got told. So the Mermaids had a big cutout of Elvis that they had inside the theater underwater for the show, so that when he came, he could see the Weeki Wachee underwater Elvis Presley fan club. Let me go back for a second. Elvis Presley brought albums and gave them to all the mermaids, and he also gave them to the hotel. They had a hotel across the street, and even some of the maids got albums from Elvis. So I thought it was really cool. And apparently Elvis, when he was taking a boat ride down the river, he asked the guy, "Why didn't you build this someplace like Madison Square Gardens or where more people could come?" Because he didn't realize it was an underwater spring, that this is a natural spring and you can't just build this anywhere, okay? So Elvis was cute, but he may not have been that smart. And so this happened in the 70s. The Mermaids went on strike. And what happened was there was a situation where 2 mermaids came to a show and almost drowned. Okay, they went to the hospital. They went into a airlock, and the air had been turned off, and so it had noxious gas in it. They ended up passing out, nearly drowning, but they ended up surviving. They were okay. But after this, they decided to strike, for more pay, for secure, safety, and things like that. And so they actually went to New York and picketed outside of ABC offices wearing their swimsuits. So that was kind of interesting. This is another one of those photos from like National Camera Week or something. They would build these huge props. They had a lot of money then because of ABC. They didn't think twice about building these big props. And by the time I came along to Weeki Wachee, the staff had shrunk considerably. And of course, Disney was the culprit. When Walt Disney came to town, at first it was good for everybody. You know, when Walt Disney built Disney World, at first it was actually good for people because it drew so many people and they only could hold a certain number of people per day. And then the overflow would go to Cypress Gardens, or they would go to Silver Springs, they would go to Weeki Wachee. And what happened is Disney kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where people would stay there for their whole week vacation. They wouldn't go anywhere else. And so the other attractions suffered, and all of them did. Silver Springs suffered, Cypress Gardens suffered. There were a lot of little attractions that just disappeared because of Disney World. But Weeki Wachee was still hanging in there, I think, because it's so unique and such an iconic Florida attraction that it was still going. You know, they were limping along, but they were still going. So their staff had shrunk, but they were still performing. And these are some of the mermaids I met, the mermaids of yesteryear. And all of them were very generous in sharing their stories with me and inviting me, you know, to come down and be behind the scenes and to see the behind the scenes stuff. So they're very, very generous to me. And this was the manatees that started coming up, and that's a picture, and you can see the castle in the background, and that airlock is under that castle. And this is Weeki Wachee today. This was a screenshot from a while back. It's a state park now, and Weeki Wachee is actually closed right now because of the coronavirus. I think you can still go down there and go kayaking, which is worth it. If you've never been to Weeki Wachee, you could go kayaking on that beautiful river, and it's really clear. The thing about Weeki Wachee, the water is still really clear there and blue. And the state has been doing a lot of, you know, refurbishing of the theater, and also, you know, trying to clean out the water. There was at one point, because of all the golf courses and things like that, that, you know, the runoff from fertilizer gets into our springs and it causes an overgrowth of algae and all kinds of issues. And so that's why here at Wakulla Springs, you know, they don't run the glass bottom boat anymore because so much fertilizer has gone into the water. There's an overgrowth of algae and it makes the water murkier, and so you can't see all the way to the bottom the way you used to. When people first came to Florida back in the early days, like 1800s, 1900s, you know, they would go out on these boats, and you know, they could go on these little glass bottom boats and look down and see all the way down to the bottom. But that has changed in a lot of these springs. There's still some really beautiful springs in Florida that are still pretty untouched, and I suggest getting out and trying to look at them. I've done that with my kids who are now grown, where we visited Florida Springs so we could see them before they get completely messed up, you know. And there's my friend Bonnie, and Bonnie's doing exactly what I'm talking about. She's doing spring cleaning in this picture, and so she was doing it back then in the 60s, and yeah, and I really appreciate her. Now I am done with my slideshow, and I wish that we could be in person so you could ask me questions, because I know that there's got to be questions, and I'm sure I left out a lot of details. But you know, if you feel like you want to ask me any questions, you can contact me. I teach at Tallahassee Community College, and you can look me up there and send me an email, and I'll be happy to answer any of the questions that you guys have. And I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you, and I hope I didn't mumble too much and that you can understand me. And again, I want to thank Linda Citro and the Lemon Bay Festival committee for inviting me to be part of this. And I hope I get to see you guys sometime, and y'all take care.